Hello, I am going to talk tonight a little bit about social groups, and from that, we're going to look a little bit at the work of Stanley Millgram. We're going to look a little bit at who he was and what he did, and as we're doing that, I am going to just scroll through some photos that were taken of the famous Millgram experiment on obedience. And this was really a very, very famous experiment that we talked a little bit about in class last week. We'll talk about it again more. It was also gone over in your video that you were to look at, but this will give you some more insight into it. So these are actual photos from the Millgram experiment. This is one of the teachers that was having to apply the shock to the students. This is a supposed student getting hooked up to the electrodes, and of course this wasn't a real student, but for the sake of the experiment it was. And this is one of the teachers just looking at his notes. This is how the experiment was set up. The teacher was at a desk. The experimenter, who is the man in the white coat kind of directing the experiment, sat behind the teacher, and then the student was behind a wall here. The teacher could not see the student, but the teacher could hear the student. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about Stanley Millgram, give you a little bit of background, and just sort of round out some of this information for you. So Stanley Millgram was a social psychologist. He is also referenced very heavily in sociology. Social psychology and sociology are actually very close. And he is infamous. He's very well remembered for his infamous obedience experiments, which could never be replicated today because we have protections against human subjects today. His research demonstrated how far people are willing to go to obey authority. His experiments are also remembered for their ethical issues, which really contributed to changes in how experiments can be performed today. Okay, so in Stanley Millgram's early life, he was actually born on August 15th, 1933, to a family of Jewish immigrants in New York City. He attended James Monroe High School, where he earned a reputation as being a hard worker, a strong leader, and he completed high school in just 3 years. One of his classmates, interestingly enough, was a to-be future sociologist by the name of Philip Zimbardo. And Zimbardo did a lot of research on authority as well. Very interesting, also very, very well known. Millgram earned his political science degree from Queens College in '54. And then at this point, he turned from political science to an interest in psychology. And he applied at Harvard to get into their graduate program in social relations. And he actually was rejected because he had never taken a single psychology course during his whole undergraduate career. He persevered, and he eventually was able to gain admission to Harvard, and he went on to earn his PhD in social psychology. And he studied under a social psychologist by the name of George Allport. Okay. So when Millgram was a graduate student at Harvard, he spent a year working with a man by the name of Solomon Asch. And Asch was interested in researching conformity. And Asch produced some very interesting conformity experiments. The one that is talked about a lot in college courses is the line experiment. This is where he went on to look at how easy it is to get people to conform and agree with something that they know is wrong. So even in his day, Milgram was controversial. He took a position at Yale in 1960, and that's where he started his obedience experiments. And again, in these experiments, participants were ordered by an authority figure to deliver those increasing shocks. Okay, and you see in this picture, you have the authority figure in the lab coat talking to the teacher, telling him that he has to continue to deliver these shocks to the student who is not saying the correct answer. Okay. As you know, as we've said, the student is actually a Confederate. He was not, the student was never getting any of these horrible shocks, but certainly the students did not know that at the time. So Milgram conducted over 19 experiments on obedience to authority. And what his experiments demonstrated was that people were willing to obey an authority figure even if the actions went against their morals. The experiments are, if you take any psychology or sociology class in college, you will run into Milgram and probably Zimbardo and Ash. Oh, sorry about that. Some of the things that Milgram's experiments demonstrated was that we as people do not know ourselves quite as well as we perhaps thought we did. What Milgram discovered was that a significant proportion of people do what they are told, irrespective of the content of the act and without pangs of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from an authority figure. Now that's quite a shocking statement, because I think all of us would not ever think we would do the things that Milgram's participants did. But the very sad thing is a vast majority of people did. Hopefully you have the gist of Milgram's experiments. So after a session was completed, Milgram's team would let the participant, the person, the teacher, know that this had been a setup thing, that the student actually was not being harmed. They would bring the student into the room with the teacher, and so all kind of was resolved at the end of it. Despite that, many people felt Milgram's experiments were unethical at the time, and certainly they would be perceived as unethical today. Are the pretty strict controls we have today on using human subjects in any type of research stem from the work that Millgram did, and the scientific community feeling they had to put a check and balance on that. So at the time Milgram was participating in these experiments, he had an opportunity to describe his experiment to a room of 39 psychiatrists. And the 39 psychiatrists were very well thought of in their respective fields. And at that time, the psychiatrists predicted that one participant in 1,000 would continue until he or she delivered the most severe shocks, 450 volts. That said, you know, death is imminent type of shock. Well, in reality, with Milgram's experiments, it wasn't 1 in 1,000. It was actually 62.5% of participants went all the way up to that 450 volts. Milgram varied the setup, his experiments a little bit. So in some of the experiments, the teacher would not touch the learner, but would remain in the same room with the learner. And when that was the case, obedience was around 40%. When the teachers were placed in a separate room, they could hear the student, but they couldn't see the student. Obedience then went up to 62.5%. When the learner did not speak, but only banged on the wall to indicate his distress, obedience increased to 65%. And when the teacher could neither see nor hear the learner at all, obedience reached almost 100%. So Millgram finally concluded that the teacher had two separate challenges that they faced. The experiment forced the teacher to decide between two stressful situations. On the one hand, inflicting pain on another person, and on the other hand, disobeying authority. And when we look at the results, the vast majority of participants would rather inflict pain than disobey authority, which really gives you some real sobering food for thought. There's no getting around that Millgram's experiments provide insights that can help us understand the choices and motivation of people who participated in the Nazi programs of persecution and mass murder. Many historians and social scientists who have studied the Holocaust say that Millgram's work does not fully explain the behavior of participants in the Holocaust. While many acted in response to orders from authority figures, some perpetrators chose to go beyond the orders they were given. Others chose to act out of their own hatred or for their own material gain without being asked even to do so. Even within the German government and military leaders and bureaucrats, they often took initiative and devised creative methods to achieve larger goals, not in response to orders, but in an effort to work toward the Führer and what the Führer, Hitler's, goals were. Again, pretty sobering conclusions. So some people who played a role in mass murder during the Holocaust later did try to explain their actions by saying that they were simply obeying the orders of an authority figure. Historian Daniel Goldhagen warns that this sort of blind obedience is not a sufficient explanation because it leaves out the extreme form of anti-Semitism that he believes motivated the German killers. He writes that individuals will only obey orders that are consistent with the values and morals they already hold. What does he mean? What is he suggesting about the moral values and beliefs of perpetrators, such as So whether this is the correct interpretation or whether Millgram's findings in his experiments are the correct interpretation, whatever it might be, I think Millgram's experiments on authority should give us all cause to pause and rethink what we know about ourselves, what we know about human behavior, and just give us pause to think. All right, hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks.